Welcome to Series 2 of the Lost in Language podcast, hosted by me, Jessica Ball. This series is a deep dive into Bohm Dialogue, a practice, process, and philosophy that I have been passionately working with for the past 10 years. Driven by his deep interest in human nature, David Bohm brought people together in dialogue to explore aspects of human consciousness at the individual, collective, and cosmic level. In this episode, I talk to Beth Macy. The common thread weaving through Beth's career has been change, having been a manager, leader, consultant, or participant in organisations experiencing difficult issues. David Bohm's research has been core to her research, writing, consulting, and teaching for nearly 3 decades. She is currently completing a book on the ideas and individuals who influence Bohm's process of dialogue. Together, we explore David Bohm's work on meaning. Inspired by his words, a change of meaning is a change of being. Beth shares both stories of Bohm's early life that gave him insight into how meaning is created, formed in, and carried through movement, and stories of her own experience with dialogue, with a powerful example of truth-telling in an organisation in crisis. I hope you enjoy the episode. So, Beth, it's really, really lovely to be with you today. Thank you for joining the Lost in Language podcast and this second series, which is a deep dive into Bohm Dialogue. And I'm really excited today to be exploring meaning within David Bohm's work and dialogue with you. But before we start, I'd just like to invite you to share how you're feeling today and anything else that you feel you'd like to share about our conversation.
Well, you picked the part of David Bohm's work on meaning that is really core to me. So it's been rocking and rolling around in me somatically and mentally, etc. And especially yesterday and today, I went to sleep thinking about it. I woke up thinking about it. And I've just been letting it, it's the flow of meaning that you talk about as being important in dialogue. I feel it moving through my body. I feel really energized, just the thinking of it. By trying to get into the mood of it, the mood of David Bohm when he talked about dialogue, lights my fire. So I'm feeling just happy, feeling energized, and I'm real curious to dive in with you because I know I'm going to learn a lot from you. And
Well, I hope something emerges that's generative and rich for both of us. I mean, you are definitely more of an expert in this than I am, but I think meaning also for me is very close to my heart. Of course, my kind of organization of one person is creating meaning inspired by David Bohm and his kind of words of a change of meaning is a change of being. So this potential and power of transformation when we come to think about meaning. So yeah, I'm also feeling quite excited and energized and really open and expansive for what we're going to explore together. But I think before we get really stuck into meaning, maybe it would be good for people listening to have a bit of an understanding about how you came to work with Bohm's work and your kind of, how you maybe briefly, something that you think other people would be interested to know about David Bohm and also your work with it.
Okay. Well, I started before I actually knew of David Bohm. I was in graduate school. I had gone back to school because I wanted to learn how change happens. So I'd had a lot of experience working in the civil rights movement in particular portion that had to do with deinstitutionalizing people who had mental illnesses or mental retardation. So it was a huge systemic effort, and I just really wanted to delve in there. And I decided to go back into the School of Management and Business Administration because I thought leaders of corporations would know that they were the ones that teach me. Well, just sort of. But I really got involved in systems theory, which then eventually led me into David Bohm's work. And I originally studied with Bill Isaacs and Peter Garrett. And at the time, I was the administrator of a large healthcare system, which was having some real difficulties in care quality and things like that. So I did a large project in one of the long-term care facilities where I taught the whole system. Everybody in the whole place that worked there, and as well as some patients, got trained on dialogue. And so it gave me the opportunity really to integrate it and live in the difficulties of it and the not knowingness, but trying to see what we come to say the flow of meaning within a big system and see the impact that it made. So that was early, but I've continued with my great enjoyment of it. It's 3 decades now I've done that, but I just learned something new just a couple weeks ago. I mean, this thrills me because I've been trying to interview and talk with as many people as I can that knew David Bohm, so I get it as close as I can. But a friend of mine shared with me a letter that David Bohm had written near the end of his life to Jonas Salk. Salk was the inventor of the polio vaccine. And you're too young probably to have remembered that, but it was a horrible scare when I was a child because so many young kids, particularly, were getting polio. So Salk is a huge hero in the world. But David Bohm wrote him a letter because Salk's organization was using dialogue, which is outstanding. But in this letter, David Bohm summarizes for Salk how he saw his career. And he goes time by time by time and saying, this is what I was learning, this is what I was doing. At the very end, and he says something to the effect, and this all culminated with my understanding of dialogue. And I thought, you talk about a flow of meaning through this man's whole life and how now it comes down to us through dialogue. So that's enough. But I just have to say, when I read that, it was like, I always thought dialogue was the culmination, but he said it. He actually said it.
Yeah, and for of those people that don't know, he was a quantum physicist, so it's quite unusual, I think, for someone in that field to feel that the culmination of their work is this way of coming together in circle to deeply listen to one another, to uncover our assumptions and biases. But we know through the work that he did around the whole and coherence and holoflux that these things, that the implicate and explicit order, the unfolding, this is how we are in relationship with one another, and how that our thought system exists within the whole. So it's sort of, I think when you know more about his work, it makes sense. But I can imagine for some people, it would seem unusual for someone to feel, having spent many years in the field of quantum physicists, like to then be working with this practice and process of dialogue. But yeah, exciting, because obviously as a dialogue practitioner and I think, someone who's excited and interested as you are around his work, from the moment that I read his book on dialogue, which someone told me to read, and they told me, oh, it will blow your mind, and it really did. And yeah, it's just stuck with me ever since. So I don't know, there's something about his work that's so deeply resonant. And maybe because it does encapsulate the whole, and like that, so that, I don't know, that sense of everything being included.
Yeah.
I think. And so we're going to talk about meaning, and so obviously within a dialogue practice, we talk about following the flow of meaning within a group. Um, how should we start then with trying to convey what meaning really is within a dialogue practice or within David Bohm's work? Because I know that you bring in some of his kind of scientific contextual element to talking about meaning. But in order not to overwhelm people who perhaps haven't been in a dialogue, haven't experienced this process, like, where do you think we should start?
Well, one of the starting places that I like to think of is I've really liked going back into David Bohm's childhood and experiences there because you can kind of see where things like meaning started to develop, but it gives a much more human experiential basis, I think, for him. And there are a couple of experiences from his early childhood that I think set the stage for all this. One was he was out with some of his little friends. You know, he was born in 1917, I think. I think that's right. So, you know, this is over a little over a century ago. He was out with some of his young friends. He must have been, I don't know, 7, 8, 9, something like that. And they were, this was in Pennsylvania in the United States, and they were in a kind of hilly, not high mountains, but kind of a climbing area. And they came to a big stream. And David Bohm had always been an incredibly left brain, thoughtful, do it by the rules kind of kid. But they had to cross the stream. So he stood there on the edge of the stream. He thought, well, I'll jump to this stone, and then I'm going to stop and think about how I need to jump to the next one and all the way across. But when he jumped the first one, he realized if he stopped, the momentum would push him into the water. And so he realized he had to go from one to one to one to one. You know, it had to go in a flowing motion, he said. And that was one of his really early thoughts about flow, that motion, that meaning travels, that the meaning is in the movement. And he'd have an entirely different meaning if he didn't move. So that was one. But the other one was one that's near and dear to my heart because I live in an area where you have tornadoes and we have to worry all the time about tornadoes. But he was, again, this is about the same age, and there was it was either a tornado or just an incredibly strong windstorm. And he was looking out the window, and the glass in the window was moving in and out, you know, and it was just about ready to crash. And he saw pieces of roofs flying across. And he said, you know what? Movement, this business of movement, it's really serious. I mean, things get created from movement. Movement makes things happen. Movement must be the thing. And so the meaning and the movement then, I think, came from these really early experiences. And the movement, the meaning is carried through the movement, but also, if you follow his work, the meaning is what says is supposed to happen. Meaning is like information. Something is being formed in movement. And what is being formed, what happens is an articulation of the meaning. It's a materialization or a happening of meaning. So I don't know if that helps. You know, add to this and help me here if that is still too.
It's making me think of being in dialogue, and when we deeply listen and we become aware. I mean, obviously you also talk about this kind of enhanced state of awareness that he had as well as a young person. And you know, we talk about dialogue, about this proprioception, having an awareness of what's happening in the moment. So you're tuning in, I guess, to those subtle changes and movements in your body. And you talk about the soma significance, the soma being the body and the significance being like the mental state. So, and how the meaning is also the relationship between those. So I think that for me is what happens in a dialogue, is the relationship between my body and like the emotions or feelings that I'm sensing as I hear what other people are saying. And they can be very like physical sensations. Sometimes I've noticed in a dialogue, my heart will start to race. And then I've begun to interpret that as, oh, I must have something important to say. Not, you know, perhaps more I would have before I might have interpreted that as like just nervous and then not said anything. But now from being in dialogue, when that happens, I'm like, oh, I think this means I have to share something of significance. So there, and then that's, I guess, the sort of mental significance. But I think also from what you were saying about, yeah, his reflections on movement being very creative or destructive, because that's part of like the eco cycle of creation and renewal and growth, is that's what happens in the dialogue. It's generative, right? That we look to see this meaning and new thinking emerge from the center. So some through that flow of meaning, things are being created like together with the group. So
Mhm.
it feels like
Absolutely.
the same creative process that of our thought and our meaning
Yes.
and our feeling.
Yeah. Yeah. So the examples I was giving of movement were ones where there was something going from this spot to this spot. It was a translocation. He liked to talk also about, he used two words, hollow movement, which was the movement of the whole. But he also talks about hollow flux
Mm,
versus movement. Because he said a lot of times we think movement is just this process of translocation. It moves from here to here. He said it really has a deeper meaning, and that's transformation.
mm,
And so, a lot of times in thinking or in creativity, if we're really still enough, we often get that flow, like you're saying, within us. There's a wiggle or a squiggle, or there's some kind of physical sensation. Sometimes it is a lot more subtle than that, and it can be this transformative process like what you were saying, the generation of new ideas isn't necessarily going from here to here.
mm,
It's a transformative process that cognitively we're able to perceive. Now, maybe we're perceiving neurons passing
mm.
messages. That's a possibility, but I think sometimes we need to expand that movement feel that description to understand it as, oh, when I listen and I really take in someone else's communication, I can't quite stay the same inside myself anymore. Just that
Mm.
deep listening and taking in causes something to shift in me. And that's
Yeah,
also a shift in meaning. That is what you were saying, the shift in being. When
yeah,
we really hear and perceive and take it in, we're changed by it. We're transformed. We're moved. I mean,
yeah.
how often do we say, I feel touched by something you said, or that really moved me?
Mm. Yeah, and I think that's why I'm really interested in this topic of meaning, particularly now in our kind of global social context, which is very fragmented and very divided. And I think people are very fixed in their mindsets. They're very fixed in their positions, they're like in their polarities. And so for me, it feels like there isn't much movement right now in our thought, and there isn't much accessing this implicate order. So can you just explain a little bit about in David Bohm's work this implicate and explicate order and how that works kind of in within meaning and I like this sort of different layers of the implicate order because that's something that language that I use a lot in my work or just my way of making sense of the world is that there's so many different layers and levels of what it means to be human. And when I facilitate groups, I try to start off at more of a universal place of like feelings or values because, that helps, right, to create trust and relationships if we can meet each other at a more universal place than the different layers and levels that we've become more and more divided. But yeah, can you explain a little bit about the implicate and explicit order?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, so he didn't use this metaphor, but I think when we hear in psychology in particular, we talk about an onion that that we're always peeling ourselves to different inner layers.
Mm.
I think from his viewpoint, and he used to like to use the terminology of turning things on their head, uh,
Mm.
he would go the other way. We're kind of like, in his idea, we're like maybe towards the core of the onion, and there are all these layers that surround us. So we in the implicate level, that implicate level is everything we know. It's everything material. It's the stars, it's the earth, it's the table that's in front of me, it's you, it's my hearing, all of our sensory things. It's our world. That's explicit. It's made explicit. But what is being made explicit? Well, it's the implicate.
Mm.
So Bohm conceived that we may be kind of at the explicate, but then there's this layer around it that's called the implicate. And I tend to think of it much like this would be a metaphor, but maybe a part of it, the laws of science. So I can experience gravity if I stumble and fall. That's at the explicate level, but at the implicate level is the law of gravity or the various laws of science and physics, the laws of how genes work, the laws of how light travels if it does. All those they're not anything we can touch.
Mm.
They're not anything material. But then there's also a super implicate level, which organizes and gives all the ways in which the implicate forms the laws for us. And those layers go on forever and ever and ever. They also go on within us because think about what science has done. Think about how over 100 years ago we thought physics had finished, was at its end. And now we are down to the Higgs boson and the Planck's dimension. On both ends of the spectrum, things continue. But now Bohm thought he also uses the term universal intelligence. Now, if you want to define that, we can't. But there's something way, way out, way, way out there, more subtle than we can ever perceive, that is setting this whole process in motion. And it is the origin spot of meaning.
Mm.
That's the origin. So, what are we doing when we're really meditating or we're in a dialogue and we're deep in concentration? We're letting go of some of this explicate process that keeps us bound, and we're opening our boundaries so that these meanings can download. It's like series of transformations. If you
Mm.
think about your study of language, what he would say is there's this process of imagination that goes from the very, very subtle, and there are transformations, much like you think of electricity going through transformations before we can finally, like me this morning, plug in my hair dryer. There's a lot of different transmutations. Well, language is one of our transmutations that it's still untangible,
Mm.
but it brings things down to which finally language can be transformed into something that's very near and dear. Now, he also felt like when there's a group of people who are able to open themselves up in this way that they can receive those meanings, that's when dialogue happens because we're all plugging in at a higher level and we're receiving meanings that are being made available. They're coming to us, but we're all perceiving at such a higher level that the powerfulness of that kind of communication, that kind of openness is very generative. We're able to bring that down and make new meaning of it. So
Yeah.
help me. What else would you like? Where can I
Well,
poke in dinner?
well, I was thinking of a metaphor that my friend Amy shared with me once that I think really relates to like the sort of secondary layer of the implicate order, which is this kind of collective shared well. So like every day she talks about you sort of imaginatively going to the well and giving something
Ooh,
back to it, but also taking from it. And for me, it's this kind of collective pool of knowledge, or like you said, universal intelligence we all have access to. Like if we understand that we're all interconnected and interrelated and interdependent and
yes.
that we are all part of the whole, then we have access to this well or pool of collective knowledge. And I think that's where the magic happens, right? When we can really access that And then, of course, maybe the secondary layer of the implicate order being what we might say in some of the sort of communication methodologies that I've been looking into, like when they use the iceberg metaphor for everything above the water is within the consciousness of the group, like the shared consciousness. So we would say the explicit, and then everything below is unconscious, or what we would say implicit. So our values or, our assumptions. And so, of course, in dialogue, we're trying to bring out those assumptions or values like to the group and making them explicit. So I think it's interesting because that bit's really important, like that we come together and we understand that we all have assumptions, we all have different values, we all have different beliefs, we all have different meaning, and that's where language is so important, because we could use the same word but it could have a completely different personal meaning. So being able to create shared meaning so that we can understand each other, even if we don't have to agree, because obviously in dialogue we don't have to agree, but we hope to understand. And that understanding in itself is transformative, like you were saying about by hearing other people's perspectives, it does change something in us, whether we like it or not. But yeah, I think that secondary layer, or like the super implicate that you're talking about, is the thing that we'll never really be able to define or prove. But for me, like it does, I feel like that exists, that is there to access, and
Yeah.
perhaps it's not being accessed by everyone at the moment.
Mhm. Very true. Very true. And Bohm, I think, is very hopeful in that regard too for us. That he thinks that I don't, I'm kind of putting my interpretation in here too, but he says that if there were just 10 people in the world doing dialogue at this very deep level, it would have a deep impact. So I think he thinks that we don't have to wait for peace to be flowing all over the world before we
Mm.
use dialogue. That doing the dialogue is part of what's going to shift the collective conscious in a way that can begin leading towards a different possibility. So I
Yeah.
think there's also a very deep sense of hope and positivity in that connecting at that creative, imaginative level. The
Yeah.
implicate.
And I imagine for some people that might be quite easy to dismiss, like, oh, well, what do you mean just by coming together and sitting in circle and listening to one another deeply? And that what difference is that going to make? I think when we look at the quantum kind of aspects of the unfolding and enfolding and sort of everything that becomes explicit then goes back in, so that we are creating these ripples within the shared consciousness, and that will have a change. And what I guess my fear is at the moment is that we're out of balance in that we've got more people that are polarized and not willing to participate in the collective consciousness and not willing to really hear one another and listen to one another. Then we have the people that are committing to showing up in these kinds of practices and processes, especially because I think we have a narrative of urgency, like we have multiple crises, which David Bohm was talking about like decades ago, right? That the reason we have all these crises is a fragmentation of thought, and it's only got worse. So how do we convince people, I guess, to be together in dialogue, that it's meaningful and transformative and powerful, when to some people it just looks like talking?
Yeah. Can I give you an example? Um, so this is a speculative one, but it's one that just zinged me in a big way. So my work throughout my life has been as an organizational consultant, and I was brought in to work with a project, a consulting project where it was a multinational company, not in the United States, it was a different country, and a big worldwide manufacturer. And I'm going to try to be careful not to say too much about that. But they had a major crisis because some of their products had caused wrongful death.
Mm.
So they had a real crisis, a real emergency. And so we were going to, the other consultants and myself, we're going to meet with the leadership team. So they were coming from different countries in the world together for an extended meeting to try to figure out what had happened, why it happened, and what they were going to do. So it was a real sense of urgency. So myself and the lead consultant had interviewed almost every one of these people beforehand. Just, and this was in very short order, but we'd had a chance to interview them. And so we had this picture of a very patriarchal organization, very top down. And the leader was kind of like the big daddy, the big father. He'd been to the weddings of all these people, he hired them personally, very interwoven. And nobody was willing to tell him the truth about what was going on because he was so dominant. So, anyway, we gathered. It was really interesting to me because I'm the only female in this group of probably 30 men, very dominant. You know? Oh, it was, interesting. But I said to the CEO, who was the papa, the granddad of this whole thing, so he knew what we were supposed to do. We were supposed to talk about what was really going on. So I stood in front of him in this big circle, and they'd never sat in a circle before. We're going to do dialogue. They've never heard a dialogue. So I stood in front of him and I said, listen, I've got to have an agreement with you that you're going to hear these things. You're going to hear some things you don't want to hear. And there's no reason for us to go forward if you can't listen. And he said, okay, I can do this. Well, it was with a lot of reminding him because he would say things to people when they responded to their, what do you think's going on here? He would say, that was stupid. And I would stop and I would say, do you have any idea how that felt to that man that just heard that from you? So, it was like really difficult. But the issue that came up in this whole thing for 3 days was truth. We can't speak the truth here. And so they started speaking the truth. And you could visibly see people, these men crying in the group, talking about how lonely they were, being so isolated they couldn't tell the truth. I mean, in various ways. It was just mind-blowing. But here's the kicker to this. 3 days, and so keep in mind, this is all about a huge experience of truth. 3 days after that, the CEO was under house arrest for having taken hundreds of thousands of dollars of bribes.
Wow.
From the government of another country in order for their products to be sold. Now, was that just going to happen anyway? Or was the truth telling powerful enough that it moved someplace and it moved a lot of other things external to just that moment, those few days? You tell me.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I'm going to say for myself, when we sit in a group and we can access that level together, we can move a lot.
Yeah.
So,
And I think truth is an interesting concept because obviously Bohm talks about how we cannot arrive at truth unless the meaning is coherent. And we have this kind of emphasis on truth or right or wrong or fact that we don't really linger on in a dialogue, because in a dialogue we talk from our own experience, and we believe that everyone in that circle has an equal value because you have a unique set of experiences to bring to the group. um
yes.
and that we might all have our own version of the truth, but yeah, what we want to do is kind of look at all those perspectives and those experiences in a way that, yeah, does create this common meaning, or shared meaning. But yeah, I think because meaning is so hard to define, and interestingly, like truth is as equally like intangible, somehow people think it's more definable maybe because they have more conviction maybe in what is true than what is meaningful. I don't know. I've never really sort of thought about it in that way before, but for where do you think people, without being in a dialogue practice, for instance, where is it that we source our meaning from? Because for me, so much of meaning is created in relationship with others. Like that's for me, being in many dialogues, something really profound is I can sit by myself and think or read or create all day long, but I will never understand as much about myself as when I'm listening to other people's experiences and perspectives.
Yeah.
So but yeah, do you think there are other ways to kind of connect with this collective pool of knowledge or sources of meaning for people?
Well, yes, no. I think when I go out and walk on my walking path, I live in an area where it's very forested, and so I have a really lovely walking path, lots of huge pine trees. And sometimes well, generally when I walk there, there's certain trees I watch for.
Mm.
And I feel like I know them and that we're communicating in some way. Um, but that's not quite like sitting in a group of people where there's something really true, but there's something very deep and emotive about my tree friends. And I worry about them when we have our bad storms, so there's a communication of something that is it truth? I can't write it down as a truth of the universe what I receive from them, but there's something very real and actual and unfiltered by a
Mm.
lot of rules. Or if I meditate, sometimes I feel very connected, and it may not even be a particular idea that comes to me. Sometimes it might be, but generally it's just a sense of connection.
Mm.
So I think there might be some other, maybe some practices or some ways in which we enact our life that make us more susceptible to participating in a dialogue. But
Mm.
we tend to make the dialogue, it's like we download things more deeply, more cognitively when we get into a dialogue because we can
Mm.
language it. So I
Mm.
think the actual language there, maybe, does that make any sense? That
Yeah,
there are
it
a lot
does.
of ways of perceiving and
Yeah.
interacting, but it takes a cauldron of sorts to transmute it down into knowable things, and language helps us with that.
Mm. I think the two words that stuck out for me were the feeling and connection. So like when you feel connected to the tree or you feel connected to something other than yourself through meditation. And yeah, I also have tree friends that I go and visit. And I think that, yeah, that sense of feeling connected to something. And, you talk about David Bohm's use of the word subtle, as
Mhm.
this kind of like finely woven. And I think it's that unprovable, like very hard to explain, intangible felt sense of being finely woven and interconnected
Yeah.
with all of life and
Yes.
energetic cosmic matter. Um, but then also, yeah, so I guess taking the time to slow down and feel into your body and be present, which we see those kinds of practices across many different kind of philosophies, right?
Mhm.
That we need to develop awareness and presence, um, and so that is that kind of connection or sourcing from something. But Do you think that David Bohm like looked at it in those kind of spiritual terms, or he was very much in his kind of scientific? Because he talked about the unknown as well, which I think is so important because that what do we really know anyway? Whereas some strands of science are very much about proving things, but maybe the quantum realm can exist with the unknown in a more comfortable and creative and generative way.
From what I understand about him, in his more metaphysical thinking, I think he felt it all came from the same source, whether it's science or art or music or philosophy or dialogue or whatever, that there aren't two sources, that there are
Mm.
different ways in which we perceive or manifest them, but they all come from the same oneness, the same wholeness.
Mm.
Um, Even when he was still a graduate student, and soon after that, he was using the physics metaphor of the plasma state, which is the fourth state of matter. And I won't go into details, but he's using his science even then to propose how we how we are together, how we can be together as entities that form something larger than our individualness. So I don't think in truth that he separated them, although he thought they had to have some different languaging. They
Mm.
had to have some different processes, perhaps. And I don't think he would agree exactly with a lot of the theorists now that like to say that our psychology and our philosophy really is exactly the same as physics. I think he would say they both
Mm.
come from the same source. I think, particularly if you've ever read some of his conversations with Renee Weber, it, she was a philosopher from Rutgers, and she was able to tease out of him this more spiritual sense. I think for him it was always there because if you look even early on, one of his earliest dreams that he talks about, he had these rays of light that were bouncing around in his brain like little tiny fingers that were trying to check him out and see what was going on inside his thoughts, his ideas, his mind. And then it would take what those little fingers were learning, and it would take them back to their source. So
Mm.
there was always a source.
Mm.
So I would say that was prominent. That was it, and it might be the generative order or something, probably was something much higher.
Mm. Yeah, I think it's really interesting when you're talking about how everything sort of comes from the same wholeness, but it's different manifestations. And when we look at kind of ecosystems around the world, like they have evolved because of that context, of the particular climate or soil or environment. And we have this beautiful, in a healthy ecosystem, diversity of living organisms, plants, trees that all work symbiotically together. And actually, in a kind of idealistic way, like that's what we would hope for in human communities, that we evolve with that place, with that within that context. And so the manifestation of wholeness is shaped by these different kind of generational cultures, traditions, rituals, art, creativity. In kind of, I guess, yeah, maybe an overly romanticized way of thinking about it. But I think for me, it's just because, again, like celebrating difference and diversity of thought and diversity of culture, because this is just a natural way that things unfold and manifest into the explicate order because of the different contexts that they arise from. And like, what could we, if we were in dialogue more, and potentially across cultures, or other points of difference, we would begin to see that is originating from a sense of some, yeah, universality that we talked about at the beginning. um,
Yeah.
but also accept that difference and learn to celebrate that difference as well and appreciate it and collaborate with it, because at the edges are some of the most generative points, right? Fertile ground, and move away from this kind of strange desire to monoculture everything, from like agriculture to the way that we look to, cultures or education. So yeah, I think that I really like that way of looking at it, because we still stay within that collective like intelligence and wholeness, but we allow for so much to unfold in such like beautiful different ways, which is creative and generative.
Yes. Yeah, you said a magic word, and that was context. I think that was really important in Bohm's thinking. Um, a dialogue is certainly a context, but there's lots of other ones. But I think what he would say is if we didn't have difference in context, which helps whatever manifestation that's going to happen, even if we all come from the same source, we manifest differently. And I think in his science and in his philosophy, both, if you didn't have that opportunity for difference, you would have to admit that everything is formed from the beginning and there is going to be no change.
Mm.
So, in order to have creativity and emergence and these characteristics that we like to clap for, so to speak, we really want to see them. That could not happen if it weren't for difference.
Mm.
And I think that's where we're getting stuck in all the examples that we can come up with the ecosystems being damaged, et cetera. It is that fixity. And I know you've talked about fixed ideas, getting stuck in fixed ideas. It's the fixedness that's blocking the creativity.
Mm.
So if we don't have the differentiation and the opportunity for it, then things become static and they die. That's when death happens, I think. So it's really
Yeah.
critical.
And I think that's what we're seeing, like this kind of static, fixed ideas, and then the sort of death and destruction that is happening, which you could say is a natural part of the eco cycle, and that we
Mhm.
have to let like old ways of thinking die off and new ways of thinking emerge, and new
Mhm.
meanings to emerge, and that we in ourselves are part of that flux on a daily basis. And I think I don't, yeah, I'm curious why some people have almost become fearful of change or difference, and that I like the analogy or the metaphor of dance. That, because it is about movement and flow and response and expression, and being able to sort of dance between polarities and not stay in any one fixed state. Because I think the moment that we really embrace this flow of meaning, this movement that leads to, like you said, instructions and guidance and action, then yeah, life becomes just more enjoyable on the basic, on the very basic level. It's just, well, I can kind of remove some sense of fear of myself, of my internal world, of others, of the unknown, and just sort of dance with it. But yeah, why do you think this sort of culture of separate, I mean, we can say that, yeah, potentially that this is all sort of manufactured, right? That these constructs of divide and difference and are creating the polarities. Someone is has an agenda. Um, but do you think there's any way to encourage people more into the flow of meaning and holoflux?
Well, you're really asking the ultimate, aren't you?
Well, yeah, I guess maybe like you might just say yes and no again, because I think it's we can't. This is the golden question of being a facilitator: is how do you get people to willingly participate? Um, and when I was started off as a facilitator and I was doing some workshops, and I did one where, well, some people turned up that I'd invited, but no one else. People that had registered they didn't show up. And this person said to me, "You need to go home and watch Sister Act 2. Like, how did she get those kids to sing?" And then I went home and watched it, and she made them. She threatened them and said, "You won't pass this class unless you come to my singing class." So of course I can't threaten or bribe people to participate. Obviously, when I work for a company, then these people know. But there are so many other ways to bring dialogue or creative facilitation into communities or to the public, and then it's really an invitation. And how, yeah, it there's no way really to force someone to come into this kind of process. But I guess if someone was on the fence and they were like, "Oh, that sounds kind of interesting, but I'm a bit nervous," what would you say to them to encourage them to take that like leap of faith and courage?
Well, and I'm just one person answering, so this isn't like a grand wisdom, I don't think. In my experience of working in organizations in particular, or setting up dialogues and any of them that I've, been set up for, people, we all have a sense of nervousness about going into a context we don't understand. And particularly when I was dealing with organizations that were in trouble and I wanted to use dialogue as a part of the process. For one thing, I never did, well, a few times I mentioned that we were going to do a process called dialogue, and all the people went and looked up David Bohm on the internet and said, "No, we don't like his science. We don't want to do that." So, but dialogue is a natural human process. It's not something that David Bohm discovered. It's a natural process. And so we all have kind of ancestral recognition of what it is. It's in our bones in some way. But what I have found most effective, and maybe not cost effective, but what works the best is when I have had enough personal conversation with the other person. They may not be convinced of dialogue in any way, but they feel trusting enough of me that I wouldn't invite them into a bad situation.
Mm.
And they may be curious. So it's not the cognitive response that I have found helps people take a chance. It's much more the unspoken uh, curiosity and sense of me that I can bring to the table, that there's something that's going to go on that they may not have they don't understand they've done before, but yeah, it might be something to do. Um, so I think most people would enter in, if they have never heard of it or done it before, a bit unknowing. But let's just pull our chairs around in a circle and let's just talk about this. It's natural. So the more we can present it as just the kind of common way we can do things and not make it into a thing,
Mm.
I think that's helpful.
Yeah, it's interesting to me, just because I see it the same way as this like very natural human way of being together, like sitting in circle and listening to one another. And I'm always surprised how radical it seems to people. So either that they're like, "Oh no, why would I want to do that?" Or when they do it and they feel the power and potential of what's happened and merged with the group, just people's immediate response, after having participated in a dialogue, as this is something really different, but it's actually not. It's like something supernatural, but we just don't do it anymore, or we don't do it enough. And I think that's the difference. Like, it's true, like, of course David Bohm didn't invent dialogue, but he understood just why, I guess, it was part of our ancestral culture for so long, coming together and being in circle, and that kind of circle also representing this wholeness and coherence. Um, and coherence, I think, is something that I'm really interested in because I sort of talk about like resonance and coherence and dissonance and really feeling when things are not, when you have a lack of coherence, you have this dissonance that creates
Mm.
such an uncomfortableness where it's almost like if, thinking about the rise of kind of conspiracy theories, I kind of understand that when everything feels like a lie, then nothing is true, so anything could be true. And there's this sort of real cognitive, somatic, like experiential dissonance in so many of our cultures right now, because I think of the lack of coherence.
Mm.
But yeah, what does it kind of mean for you in terms of wholeness and coherence and meaning within this practice?
Mm. Well, I think coherence is where we would like to go. But I think dealing with the dissonance is how we get there.
Mm.
I mean, if we're all alike and we're all coherent, what are we going to talk about other than to make ourselves feel real good about being coherent? I think the dissonance is part of that process that lets us grow and differentiate.
Mm.
Now, that doesn't mean it's always going to happen either. I mean, it can also dissolve things. Uh, but I would say, well, I think coherence can tend to help ameliorate or dissolve the dissonance. And again, from my experience in working with groups, there can be even or on a one-on-one, if I'm myself coming from a place of relative coherence, because I'm never totally coherent, but if I've got a lot of space inside of me that is available to the experience that's going to happen, then I can kind of draw out and hold a little bit of that other person's dissonance
Mm.
in a way that gives them some relief and gives them a little bit of space so that maybe they have a momentary experience of things that are calming. um, all of us really respond well when we have the sense that we've been accurately seen or heard or gotten. I don't know better terms for it. Somebody got me. If I'm in that kind of space where I get somebody, even though they're radically different than me, and I'm not agreeing with it, but I'm getting it, it creates a bit of space for them. Now that can be on a one-on-one or it can be in a dialogue, but I think there's a tremendous amount of power that comes to a group situation or a twosome even when there are one or two or three people who provide that space. Now,
Mm.
that's not something that happens necessarily for a whole huge collective all at once, but it also tells me that we as individuals have a lot of power in our own context. And if I just isolate myself with other people with whom I'm coherent, it doesn't have a chance to play out in
Yeah.
community. So
And
I know there are some people in my community who are really politically charged as I am too, but they don't like they don't want to buy services of any kind from somebody from the other side. And I picked out this guy that to have my haircut with, who's a secret member of the militia in Texas. It's
wow.
like, but I really try to have him talk about himself when I'm with him. Just for that reason. I don't know if it's doing anything or not. It sure teaches me a
Mm.
lot. But it's our one-on-ones, I think, that can start changing all this if we can bring that presence with us.
And it's really making me think back to meeting people at that universal level, because when we get into conversations about like beliefs or ideologies or like theories or concepts, I think it creates more conflict because it's not truly who we are necessarily at that meeting point. Whereas I find by bringing people back down to that, well, how are you feeling? What are your values? And what are your experiences? Like you're trying to do with that man, you're trying to really get him or find out about who he is on that level. Then that feels more kind of fertile for like creating that common meaning and that mutual understanding than just constantly kind of fighting it out around our beliefs. Um, but it is very hard. I imagine, yeah, there's some people that will wonder why you're continuing to having your haircut with that man because his ideology and his beliefs are so extreme. But yeah, like you said, you feel that you have this spaciousness to meet him at this other level of what it means to be human, in the hope that, yeah, that might create something, some like we talked about that movement or that flux or that
Mhm.
transformation or a shift in the
Yeah.
fabric of our collective consciousness.
Yeah. And I'm not necessarily trying to change his mind on anything.
Mm,
I'm not going to. If you just meet this, as you were saying, if you just meet it cognitively, you're just going to get more entrenched. But
mm,
I think there's something much deeper that I don't know how to respond to right now. But when I look at in my own country, the deep polarization of the extremely right segment, it feels to me like there's tremendous fear, just tremendous fear that these people feel that they need a strong man to protect them. There's
mm,
something that's going on here culturally that I don't quite grasp yet. And I just really have this need to talk to some people. So, some of these folks, I'm really trying to figure out what is this mechanism under the surface that's so deep that it can polarize millions of people. I
mm.
don't quite get that. So I don't know how I'm ever going to get that unless I keep listening.
Yeah. No, I mean, similarly here, we have an increasing far right movement, and recently this week, riots, and so much mis and disinformation being spread about things. But I'm the same as you. I want to understand how people come to this state of being. Um, and of course, I think, yeah, technology and algorithms have so much of a role to play in furthering fragmentation and siloing people in their bubbles of thought that just constantly reaffirms their beliefs and strengthens their beliefs and thinks that that's the entirety of knowledge, and that they've lost this sight of the cohesive whole, as David Bohm would say, like that. And only by coming together with people that are different do we really stay, I think, within that potentiality of what happens when we do bring different thoughts and experiences together. But we're sort of going back to that fear. I think yeah, it's the fear of coming together now in groups, and that's further, you know furthered by cancel culture and this fear of speaking truth. Like, the example that you gave is so powerful from that organization, because I think there's so many instances where people are afraid of speaking truth and the consequences or repercussions of that, and this kind of power over paradigm of feeling censored, and unable to speak the truth. So, and having your truth really heard and accepted, not as the truth, but your truth. And then
Yeah.
those truths together is where we find that meaning, that, well, what does this mean when we've heard everybody's truth? Then we use our collective intelligence and we think together, well, what does that mean? Like, and I love when David Bohm talks about how meaning is the cement that holds society together, and that at the moment we have like really poor quality cement. And it's true
Mhm.
because we don't have these spaces for people to come together from like different like ways of thinking and being, and just really share that in a way that, not that we don't invite conflict into a dialogue, because obviously it's sort of framed as an opportunity for learning and growth and we move through the conflict, but like it's a respectful, way of dealing and managing with conflict and difference. um
Mhm.
so yeah, it seems essential to the world that we create, yeah, whether it's just one-to-one with your hairdresser or whether it's in an organization or a community, these spaces for people to really be heard and hear one another.
I'm having a funny experience right now. I will keep this person kind of nameless right now, but I was noticing on Facebook that there was one particular musician who about whom there are things posted quite often. And he had supposedly participated in an interview and it was quoted, and it really offended me. It felt very misogynistic. I don't know this guy. I don't even listen to his music much. But I said, but I read this and I rarely do this, but I put a comment on there like, what? Where's reciprocity in what you said?
Mm.
And, I'd forgotten all about it. This was an outburst of, and the next day I had a message in my Facebook Messenger thing that said, perhaps you could direct mail me because I think we need to talk about this. I said,
From the actual musician or from someone else?
well, I don't know. I mean, it said it was him. How do you know? And so I responded, yeah, you bet. Well, you assure me that you are XYZ first, and then we'll talk about it. So he left me a voicemail. And it sure sounds like him. Well, I don't know, but we've had just a few. I mean, it's not like it's a romantic come on or anything, but it was bothersome to him that I saw him in this
Mm.
misogynistic view, which he doesn't have of himself, and he wants to know why. I
Mm.
thought, but it's another little way. Uh, I mean, I didn't plan this, but it's just interesting that we can impact each other by the getting and by the trying to incorporate and respond to each other. I think one-on-one and little group communication can be so powerful that way.
Yeah, definitely. As long as we feel safe to speak the truth, I think, because lots of things are overlooked because someone doesn't feel able, like, you felt able to respond to that in an authentic way. But someone else might be like, oh, I'll get, cancelled, or actually
Yeah.
it's probably not that big a deal. I mean, yeah, I feel like there is a lot of lacking of accountability within some, yeah, different spheres, particularly around, yeah, misogyny. It's just this allowance of things to be said or things to be done. Um, and yeah, I think with these things, it really goes back to the layers, because, when we look at something like misogyny, we'll look at it on one layer of meaning, but there are so many other deeper layers. And down the bottom, yeah, I think I'm the same as you, that there's maybe a fear, or you know a feeling of insecurity of not fulfilling a role of what it means to be a man in like the divine sacred masculine way, perhaps, if we use that
Mm-hmm.
language. And not
Mm-hmm.
being able to fulfill that role and feeling less than. And then there's so much complex emotion and history and construct that has to be kind of uncovered. So we do need to go much deeper into, like David Bohm says, we have to go to the root cause where the pollution is entering the water upstream to see what is happening. So not just looking at it on that surface level, and a willingness to, yeah, to sort of go through those different layers of meaning together. And I think you have to have quite a lot of grace with people to do that with them, and not just sort of fight it out on the first level.
Yeah. And I think there's also, I think you brought up a point in terms of there are a lot of people in the world that don't have the freedom truly to tell the truth. Um, I come from a culture, and I think you too, where particularly for women the last few decades, we have been pretty free to be able to speak. And that's a short, tiny little pause in the history of humanity where that's possible. Um, but that hasn't always been there. But there are a lot of people. I was thinking of a young man from Russia who is a dialogue facilitator and has been involved with dialogue for a long, long time. And I think about him often with all that's going on there. Um, he he uses dialogue. He's in theater, and he uses dialogue to bring together the cast of a production that's being done so that they can work and so they really integrate themselves as a group and then can play out their roles on stage in
Mm.
in a in a really meaningful way. I think it's brilliant, but I just get concerned for him that for his safety in trying to bring dialogue into a situation like that and what courage this guy has to do that. Now I don't know how he does it. I don't know if he calls it dialogue or if he once you name something, then somebody else can attack it more easily. But
Mm.
I just want to give notice. I don't know how we support people in these situations where they can't tell the truth. And there are plenty of them.
Mm. Well, perhaps by, like you were saying, being in dialogue ourselves and hoping that we can somehow influence the fabric of our collective consciousness, unconscious,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
in order to rearrange that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Or I'm there, I mean, but as much as there's many different layers and levels of being human, there's many different ways of contributing to the world. Like we again need a kind of diversity of approaches. So there isn't one solution or one way of
Yeah.
of of contributing to this kind of transformation that we hope to see or bring about or contribute to.
Yeah. Well, it makes me wonder. I've never thought this through, so I'm talking in a way that's really off the top of my head at the moment. But I wonder if our efforts with dialogue are best deployed in contexts where it is hopeful. In industry, I hear the word a lot, the low-hanging fruit. Maybe it's good that we focus, not that we stop our individual efforts wherever we may be, but maybe it's worth just spending more of our dialogue effort in places where we can support other people to become their own dialogue facilitators, not necessarily in organizing dialogue groups, but so that they're carrying their own personhood out in that way and developing more change agents within.
Mm,
Not as a formal role, even, but to help people be
yeah.
better individuals or better group participants.
To
That
have
sounds
the
very elitist. I don't like the sound of it, but I
But
don't
I
know.
think it's about having, well, the spirit of dialogue within ourselves and that kind of relationship to ourselves, and how we go about being in the world. And that's kind of our bodily experience, our cognitive experience, our feeling, heart center. So there's, the full experience of what it means to be human is in itself actually dialogic because
Mm-hmm.
we have all these different subpart, right, subwholes, right? So when David Bohm talked about wholeness, when he talked about the parts, or like we're all a part or a subwhole of the wholeness, but
Mm-hmm.
within us, like we have yeah, we're also a system of all these other different like subwholes or parts. Maybe we're their parts of our
Mm-hmm.
subwhole. Um, and how, yeah, the meaning that they create. Like I feel like we're meaning makers, and we're like systems of meaning. And like you talked about with the meaning, information, guidance, movement, form, it's like we're constantly getting new information that's guiding us forward
Mhm.
in our action. But understanding, I guess, the wholeness of that source of information. So it's not that I'm getting my information from my like Instagram algorithm, but that I'm really out there in the world getting my information from the entirety of the world and everyone else in it. So that, yeah, I feel like that kind of, if everybody could have a spirit of dialogue and carry that around, we'd be
Yeah.
more open to one another, hopefully.
Yeah. I had this image. I wish I had a port, when I need to keep my cell phone charged in, I just plug it in. I wish I had a plug. You'd say, David Bohm, plug me into your super implicate order and just let me stay there while I walk around in these trouble spots here.
Mm. Well, maybe you can in some way, and they're like, yeah, the folding and unfolding. You are, because if we're everything and nothing, then you are.
That is an aspect of meaning. I'm kind of changing the subject here. I hope that's okay. But
Yeah.
what you're saying is in David Bohm's work, he says something that just blows me away. And that is that the circle of meaning, it isn't like a one-way communication down and it stops with me. He talks about how much the universe needs us to come back with our experience to it.
Mm.
And that we ourselves are, by being able to be part of the flow. And this isn't like we need to do this necessarily consciously. We don't say, okay, I'm going to upload here, but it does happen. So what's going on with us is part of the flow back uh, to that universal source by which it then integrates and sends something back down. So, to me, in my own sense of wanting to be hopeful about a worldview or a way I can picture myself as using my life meaningfully, if I want to be conscious of that because what I'm doing in my thoughts and what I'm doing with my actions goes someplace. It means something to the universe what I'm doing here. And
Mm.
that's something I don't hear people talk about that side of the equation very much, but it just seems to me it's something important. How we are here goes back to where it came from and influences that original source. Does that make sense to you?
It makes 100% sense because I guess I'm very influenced by kind of people like Robin Wall Kimmerer and her writing, and really thinking about what reciprocity means in many indigenous cultures, and that kind of relationship of giving and receiving to Mother Nature and the cosmos. So I think that's something that, I have a felt sense of, whether I don't feel the need to kind of particularly share that with others in any really public way, but it's something meaningful for me as to have this sense of gratitude, because I think that's one way of acknowledging what you
Mm-hmm.
receive, and then sense of kind of purpose or potential in what we can give. And yeah, I saw your video with the question of, well, what does the universe um mean? No,
What we mean to the universe.
what do we mean to the universe? And I think I had this thought of this year. I sometimes go to ecstatic dance, and I saw this tiny little chip on the wall. Because I'm quite introverted, I like to sort of dance to the wall, not to everyone else in the room. And I saw this tiny little chip, and it was shaped like a heart. And then I did turn around and I saw all these beautiful human beings just, completely free and dancing. And I just really had this thought of like, well, all these people are bodies of love and human potential. And
Mm-hmm.
that's really stuck with me of like when I look at other people now, and sometimes if I feel like judgments coming in or arising as they naturally do, I'm like, no, they're a body of love and human potential. And I think that's for me like what I mean to the universe is this constantly unfolding body of love and potential. Um, because yeah, there isn't like again, we can't really sort of fall into like fixed senses of self, like this is exactly what I mean to the universe. It's like, no, I'm this constant flow of energy and movement and potential that is unfolding into the world and the cosmos and coming back to me by this, yeah, practice of kind of presence and gratitude and yeah, the integration and the coherence that we kind of strive for in our lives. But I don't have that. Feels
Now,
like
you used a term way back when we were starting this conversation that we make meaning. We're meaning makers. And that's what I'm hearing you say right now again in some different words is we make meaning for the universe. We're meaning makers for ourselves, for those around us, but but we're um very essential processors for the universe to take that flow that comes to us and let it
mm,
live through us and let it travel through us and let it change us. So
mm,
I really like that saying. I'm going to remember that we are meaning makers.
mm. But I think one thing, I guess, as we sort of come to a close of our conversation, maybe I'll move into sort of some of my reflections, is
Mhm.
just really this level of, yeah, the universal, because there are stories that we tell ourselves about the world and our role in it. And I don't know, and some of those stories, like we've been talking about, create a sense of dissonance or a lack of coherence within ourselves. And I don't really know how that manifests. Well, I think it manifests in unhealthy behavior, but equally we've been talking a lot about polarities and wholeness. So like all our types of behavior are within the whole. And I often think like we're all capable of everything good or bad in the world. Like when I see people that have done terrible things, I'm like, well, part of them is also in me and vice versa. So I think acknowledging that wholeness and not separating ourselves from the things that are more challenging or distressing or difficult because suffering is a part of life. So that's why I think always being able to dance between the polarities is really important for me to not get stuck in one way of thinking, because then we fall into self-righteousness and like you said, we start to alienate other people and we forget the common humanity. So I think anything for me that can bring us back to the source of our collective meaning making, being more in this really beautiful place of common humanity and like values, feelings, and experience. I think if we can start there, then everything else becomes more generative and more coherent. And yeah, we don't have to agree, we don't have to have the same beliefs, but like you said, at some point, like really beginning to feel like the other person gets you and that you're seen and heard and known. And then trusting, yeah, that some kind of transformation might take place because we're part of that movement. Yeah, I think that's really what's really sort of solidified in a non-static rigid way for me is so maybe it's ice but it's going to melt again, is this kind of feeling of, yeah, where do we meet to make the meaning? And like we meet at this deep level and layer of what it means to be human, which is why we sit in a circle, which is why we listen to each other, which is why we connect to our values, which is why we talk about our personal experiences and why we share our feelings, because these are the things that we all experience, no matter who we are or where we've come from. Um, so, yeah, I thank you for helping me gain that insight.
Hmm. Well, I've delighted in this conversation. So if it brought you to such a beautiful endpoint, um, I'm very happy. And you wouldn't have gotten to that endpoint if it weren't for all the internal work that you've been doing, all the work and dialogue that you've been doing. So the conversation might have been helpful, but it was the context, but you were the content here. So thank you for inviting me.
Is there any last thing that you would like to share around meaning or anything that we've talked about today?
Mm, I think that the point for me that still is the most intriguing, I've already said,
Mm,
but the fact that in David Bohm's ideas of dialogue and in his sense of the cosmology, we are participants. And I think we forget that we're important to the universe. And
mm,
so how we open ourselves to it is it's important, and that we are important. I guess that's maybe part of the whole thing we've been talking about is there's so many experiences in life that cause us to forget that we are each individually important here. Maybe that's a part of what dialogue, in addition to the group process, that it lets us participate as whole people. It brings us to our individual wholeness that lets us participate in that way. And I love David Bohm for having had those insights and for having shared them with us all.
mm.
I think
Thank
that would
you.
be my ending point.
Well, thank you so much, Beth, for such a rich and flowing conversation and for helping co-create meaning together. And I wish you a lovely rest of your day.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
You've been listening to the Lost in Language podcast. If you would like further information on the guests and topics explored in this series, please visit creatingmeaning.club. Thanks for listening with us in our search to get to the meaning beyond the word.